Okay, this week in Mortal Questions, Unit 5, we're talking about the question that is almost the stereotypical question of philosophy, and that is the meaning of life. In the beginning of Belshaw, he describes a London cab driver who tells the story, who says, "One day I had Bertrand Russell in the cab, so I said to him, 'Well then, Lord Russell, what's it all about?' And you know, he couldn't tell me." The point being that Lord Russell, who was Bertrand Russell, was a very famous philosopher. So the cab driver assumed that being a philosopher, he would know what's the point of life, what is the meaning of life, and Bertrand Russell couldn't answer. He did actually have something to say on it, but it was negative. There's a very famous piece by him called "A Free Man's Worship," where he actually argues that life isn't really meaningful. And Russell was an atheist, among other things, but Bertrand Russell had a very long life. He started out being a mathematician, and his earliest and most respected philosophical work is in logic and math, and he wrote a book that nobody reads because it's far too technical, called Principia Mathematica, that is supposed to be like a work of genius. But then he went on, and he was sort of a proto-hippie. He advocated free love and stuff like that, all the while walking around smoking a pipe in a way that looked very unhippie-like. And he lived long enough to stage a mock trial for Nixon and get arrested for protesting for nuclear disarmament. So he had a very long and interesting life. The point being that he's a philosopher, and this London cab driver assumed that he would know about the meaning of life. It's the question that philosophers are supposed to wrestle with above all. And actually, many philosophers don't really. Philosophy in the 20th century in particular got into more kind of technical areas. But there are certainly philosophers who do write on it, and you're reading some of them. Actually, the first person besides Belshaw, so you're reading a chapter from Belshaw, but the first person after that you're reading is Leo Tolstoy, who I was shocked and appalled to discover last time I taught this most people have not heard of. He was at one time probably the most famous writer in the world, and has been ranked as the greatest novelist in history. You've no doubt heard of War and Peace and Anna Karenina. Well, they were written by him. He lived in the 19th century, Russian. And he was not one of these people who was only appreciated after his death, like Charles Dickens. He was appreciated greatly during his lifetime and became incredibly wealthy because of the vast numbers of copies that his books sold. And it's in that context that my confession begins. He is enormously wealthy, enormously successful. He's happily married. He owns a farm that he's always dreamed of having. He's always wanted a farm. He's got one. He's strong. He's healthy. He works on the farm tirelessly and enjoys it. He enjoys his writing. And then something happens to him that he describes in near the beginning of my confession. He makes an analogy with someone who has got a mortal disease but doesn't realize it at first. At first there appear insignificant symptoms of indisposition. This actually he turned into a story, another a famous story by him called The Death of Ivan Ilyich. And in that story, this guy is putting up curtains or something, and he falls and bumps his side or something very insignificant, and it eventually leads to his death. And it means something, but you have to read that. Anyway, this is An analogy, he says. At first there appear insignificant symptoms of indisposition, to which the patient pays no attention. Then these symptoms are repeated more and more frequently and blend into one temporally indivisible suffering. In other words, there's no break. And this, he says, happened to him only in a sort of philosophical sense. I understood that it was not a passing indisposition, but something very important, that if the questions were going to repeat themselves, it would be necessary to find an answer for them. And I tried to answer them. The questions seemed to be so foolish, simple, and childish. The questions being, as he's mentioned earlier, these arrests of life found the expression in ever the same question, why, well, and then. In other words, whenever he's thinking of doing something, like tending to his Samara estate, that's his big farm that he bought with all his money from his books and that he loves. You know, it's a big farm. It needs decisions made about how to run it. So people come to him and say, what should we do about this? Or to his son's education. And he loves his son. He's very fond of his family. It's not like, you know, he's detached from his family at all. So he really cares about his son's education. Or writing a book, which is obviously his life's work. Whenever a decision has to be made, suddenly up crops in the back of his mind this question, why? Why do that? What's the point, in other words? And at first he thought these were, as he says, foolish, simple, and childish. You know, what do you mean, why? Why should I write a book? Or why should I make sure that my kid goes to a good school? Or why should I make this decision about how to run my farm? Why are you asking why? Why ask why, as the Budweiser commercial used to go. But it gnawed at him. And he gives another analogy, which is a famous story. It's actually a Buddhist fable. He recounts it as an Eastern story of a traveler who's chased by a savage beast, and to escape jumps down a well and sees as he's falling down the well that there's a dragon at the bottom, and grabs hold of a branch halfway down and hangs on to the branch. And as he's hanging there, suspended between a savage beast above and a savage beast below, he sees a black mouse and a white mouse encircling the branch, nibbling away at it, which of course is an analogy for day and night. Day and night is passing, and eventually your time's coming when they'll chew through the branch and you'll fall down into the dragon's mouth. But the story, the Buddhist fable goes, while he is still clinging, he sees some drops of honey hanging on the leaves of the bush. Or in another version, it's a rose, and the rose smells beautifully sweet. And so he reaches out for them with his tongue and licks the leaves. Just so I hold on to the branch of life, knowing that the dragon of death is waiting inevitably for me. And in the Buddhist telling, you know, basically it's meant to say life is impermanent, but nonetheless, it's sweet. You can enjoy the sweetness of the honey. But the kicker in Tolstoy's retelling is, I try to lick that honey which used to give me pleasure, but now it no longer gives me joy. And the white and the black mouse day and night nibble at the branch to which I am holding on. I clearly see the dragon, and the honey is no longer sweet to me. In other words, he just can't enjoy it. And part of the reason seems to be because he can't take his mind off the dragon. In other words, he is fixated on his death. And the fact of his death seems to have robbed his life of all joy. And not just joy, but a sense of purpose. Which is why he keeps asking the question, why? For even altruistic things, normally, even if he didn't enjoy his life, he could at least care about his children. But as he says, this mental condition expressed itself to me in this form. My life is a stupid, mean trick played on me by someone. And as it is on him, so he sees it being on his children. So it's like, he can't even sort of say, well, never mind me, I've got to care about my children, because he thinks, well, their life is meaningless too. What's the point of their life? I mean, it's bad enough that I've had this stupid, mean trick played on me. Why I shouldn't want it played on my children as well. So it's a pretty serious situation he finds himself in. And this was a genuine incident in Tolstoy's life. This really happened, that he had this kind of crisis. Now, in my confession, the sort of autobiographical story that you're reading, it resolves itself. It resolves itself after going through two approaches and finding both wanting. The first one is rational scientific approach. And according to the rational scientific approach, we are just accidents. This is the view of science. We are not, human beings are just an accident. We're not important. We're not the center of anything. We're on one tiny planet in one tiny solar system, in one tiny galaxy, in an infinite universe. And life only evolved here because of a series of massive coincidences. But of course, because the universe is infinite, this will have happened elsewhere in the universe, and there will be, other races, other aliens as well, and they're equally, random and pointless too. So to ask why we're here, we just are. That's a silly question, according to rational thought. And of course, that's not the answer that gives him any comfort. And the alternative is the kind of religion that he's been raised in, which would have been Russian Orthodox. And he finds that as just mystical and gobbledygook, essentially. It's just, it doesn't give comfort either. He compares the two viewpoints. One, he climbs a tree in the forest, and he sees all the forest before him, and there are no houses. In other words, the houses are sort of analogies for finding meaning in life. That's the rational viewpoint. But then he comes down the tree, and he's in the darkness, and that's sort of the mystical viewpoint of, God moves in mysterious ways, you must have faith. And he doesn't find that appealing either. Except he talks himself round to a version of faith. It's not presumably Orthodox religion. He finds comfort in what he sees, which sounds rather patronizing, as the faith of the simple folk, peasants who work on his farm. And he sort of compares their happy, simple lives with the miserable, tortured lives of his rich, wealthy, intellectual friends who fear death, go screaming to their deathbed, whereas the simple folk, thick in the arm and thick in the head, who work on his farm, die, live poor, die happy. Yeah. I'm sure all of them would say, no, don't give me that rich, pampered life, heaven forbid that I want my nice, simple, poor life. It sounds very romanticized, and Tolstoy was a big romantic, as you will know from Anna Karenina. But he sort of resolves to take their viewpoint and just to believe that life has a purpose. And it seems like he's sort of making himself believe that, just so that he could escape this crisis. He says, what then was faith? I understood that faith was not merely an evidence of things not seen, which is a Christian quote, and so forth. Not revelation, again, organized religion. Not the relation of man to man. Not merely an agreement with what man was told. That faith was the knowledge of the meaning of human life, in consequence of which man did not destroy himself but lived. Faith is the power of life. If a man lives, he believes in something. If he did not believe that he ought to live for some purpose, he would not live. I've heard this sort of sentiment expressed, that people whose lives are pretty shitty say, I've got to believe there's a point to this, because if I didn't, I'd just commit suicide. And that sounds essentially like what he's saying. That I'm just going to have faith that there's a point to all this. And find happiness in simple tasks. And actually, in his later life, Tolstoy did give away an awful lot of property, much to the annoyance of his family that was going to inherit it. and lived a very sort of genuinely Christian life, in that he gave to the poor and lived amongst the poor and so on. So this was a sort of road to Damascus moment for Tolstoy. Now, clearly he was confronted with a genuine challenge about the meaning or the purpose of his life. We're going to treat those things as essentially the same. The only person who really tries to make a distinction between meaning and purpose is William Lane Craig, and I'm not sure he clearly makes a distinction between meaning and purpose. So I'm going to talk interchangeably in general those words, meaning and purpose. I'm going to assume that for life to be meaningful, it must be purposeful, and that having a purpose would give it meaning, and so on. Okay, so he feels that he has to find meaning, and another writer, a 20th century writer, Albert Camus, the French or Algerian existentialist writer whose most famous work is L'Étranger, or The Stranger, or sometimes translated as The Outsider. There's a band called The Cure. I don't know if you're familiar with this. They were kind of big in the 80s. They're like Depeche Mode. They're one of these bands that were big in the early 80s in England and then became huge in the late 80s, early 90s in America, particularly Los Angeles. Anyway, they had an early song called, rather unfortunately, Killing an Arab, which they later regretted calling it that, but the reason why it's called that is because it's basically based on an incident in Camus' book L'Étranger, where the main character just shoots someone who happens to be Arabic. And remember, Camus is from Algeria, which is, there's a large Arabic population. And in L'Étranger, or The Outsider, he's just supposed to be facing this problem of not seeing a purpose with his life, and he just does things almost to create meaning. That's a very bad interpretation, but I'm not a literary theorist. Anyway, if you want to get the plot of L'Étranger, listen to the Cure song Killing an Arab, and it basically sums up what happens in it. But it's an illustration of Camus. Camus, like the other famous French existentialist, Jean-Paul Sartre, was both a writer and a thinker, a philosopher. Both of them wrote novels. I think both of them won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Like Camus' L'Étranger, and Sartre wrote plays like No Exit and works of fiction like Nausea, but also philosophical works like Being and Nothingness. And Camus' famous philosophical work on this topic is called The Myth of Sisyphus, and he's the first person to bring up the story of Sisyphus as an illustration of the problem of life, if life doesn't have meaning. Sisyphus, you might know, you should know if you've done the reading, was cursed by the gods as punishment. He was cursed with immortality, which is interesting, because you might think that it would be better just to kill someone. But of course, this has analogies in the Christian idea of hell. Hell is essentially immortality. It's just an immortality of suffering. Well, Sisyphus's punishment was to roll a rock up a hill and almost get to the top, but to have the rock roll to the bottom of the hill for all eternity. So his task is to roll the rock to the top of the hill, and he never gets there ever. He always gets nearly to the top, and then it escapes and rolls down to the bottom, and that's his curse. And the point is, it's a horrible curse, partly because, or perhaps mostly because, his life doesn't have meaning. He can't achieve anything. He never gets to achieve anything. And if this is an analogy for our lives, it's a sad one, because then it means, like Sisyphus, we have in effect been cursed by the gods to a pointless existence. Alright, so the challenge is to try and work out if life can have a meaning. Now, Belshaw points out that there are a few reasons why we might think life lacks meaning. And these occur to people at some point in their lives, usually. Like, for example, for Tolstoy, it seemed to be the prospect of his death. So life being short or finite, even if it's long, it's still finite, and it's short from the point of view of the universe. It's like a blip. That makes our lives seem insignificant, and that's supposed to mean, well, what's the point? Take a walk through. I'm from England, and we have graveyards with, gravestones in them dating back hundreds of years. And you can take a walk through these graveyards. We have churches going back to the 1200s and stuff. And of course, all over Europe and actually, there are Native American burial grounds, of course, that date back that far here. But you can go through a churchyard in England, and you can find gravestones with people's names on, and dating back hundreds of years, and you can think, nobody knows anything about this person anymore. And you think to yourself, well, then what was the point of them living? It's like, they're gone, they were an insignificant speck, they've been forgotten, what's the point? And of course, their names are at least recorded, but of course there are millions and millions of people who have died and are completely forgotten, and we will never know anything about. And this causes some people to think that, well, I'll be like that, and in 1,000 years I'll be forgotten, what's the point? And of course, human life as a species is probably gonna die out. It doesn't look like we're going to get off this planet in time. When they walked on the moon in 1969, it looked like we were going to all be heading to Mars in a few years, but nobody cares about NASA anymore, so we're stuck here as the planet heats up. And Ebola breaks out all over. Apparently they found a case in New York. So so life is limited and brief, where we are, even if our lives were long, we would still be minuscule in comparison to the universe. From the point of view of the universe, we're a tiny, insignificant speck, on this planet and in one galaxy amongst billions and billions and so on. Life involves struggle. Schopenhauer is a philosopher that doesn't get talked about much nowadays, but he was a gloriously gloomy writer. He's a big favorite of Woody Allen's. Woody Allen, whenever he talks about philosophy, and he was fascinated in philosophy, always talks about Schopenhauer. We begin in the madness of carnal desire and the transport of voluptuousness. We end in the dissolution of all our parts. In other words, we rot, and the musty stench of corpses. And the road from one to the other goes, in regard of our well-being and the enjoyment of life, steadily downhill. Happily dreaming childhood, exultant youth, toil-filled years of manhood, infirm and often wretched old age. He ends up, does it not look as if existence were an error? Which sounds like Tolstoy's a line about it being a stupid, mean joke. The consequences of which grow more and more manifest. So life sucks, that's another reason. And the last reason is, if there is no God, there's no point to life. And in the 19th century, intellectuals like Tolstoy's buddies were all convinced that there was no God. Many intellectuals today share the same view. So that brings us to a good division of the readings. The Tolstoy, as we've seen, resolves his crisis by finding faith. Now, whether or not he is right to do so is another question. You might decide that he's just deciding to delude himself or something like that, but certainly he finds it in faith. William Lane Craig, another of the readings, is a very, I'm searching for the right word, adamant Christian thinker who argues against atheism. He will debate any atheist who will agree to have a debate with him. You can go online and look for debates with William Lane Craig and all sorts of people, atheists. So he takes the Christian line right down the line, and he argues that there's no point to life. There's no meaning, purpose, or value, and by value he means morality, which is another common claim, that you can't have morality without God. All of these things require both God and an afterlife, immortality. Let's remind ourselves of terminology I think I introduced a while ago, but it's worth repeating that, and that's necessary and sufficient. Remember, something is necessary for something else. A is necessary for B if you can't have B without A. Necessary meaning you've got to have it. He's saying God and immortality and afterlife are both necessary for meaning, purpose, or value. You've got to have them. Now, he does point out that having an afterlife by itself, although it's necessary, in other words, you cannot have meaning without an afterlife, without immortality, it's not sufficient. Sufficient, remember, means enough in itself. So my examples I always give, being a whale is sufficient for being a mammal. That is, if you know something is a whale, that guarantees that it's a mammal. But it's not necessary. You don't have to be a whale in order to be a mammal. You can be a cat, you can be a human, there are many kinds of mammal. Okay, so he's saying that's an example of sufficient but not necessary. An example of necessary but not sufficient is having gas in your car. Having gas in your car is necessary for your car to start, but it's not sufficient. You can have a tank full of gas, but if you've left your lights on, your car isn't going to start. But your car certainly won't start without gas. So he's saying the afterlife is necessary but not sufficient, and the little story he uses to illustrate this is the one of the astronauts stuck on a barren asteroid who wants to kill himself because his life is pointless, and by accident takes an immortality serum. Poison immortality. Oh, whoops! I get them. What kind of scenario is this? That you have, unmarked tubes of poison and immortality serum. But anyway, in the story, he accidentally drinks the immortality serum, and it's the worst thing he could have done. So having immortality is not a good thing. Something illustrated in the Star Trek episode from last unit, where there's that immortal being Q who wants to stop being immortal because he's bored of life. Okay, but he does think that God and immortality are necessary, and actually he thinks having both of them, if you have both of them, then that is sufficient. If you have God and immortality, then your life will have meaning. All right. What are the possible ways that our life could have meaning? And here, a lot of the writers that you read make a distinction between two possible ways. And I'm going to use the labels objective and subjective. So, and I'll explain what I mean. For something to objectively have meaning, that means it has meaning whether or not that thing knows it, or whether or not that thing wants it. In other words, the meaning that it has is independent of what the thing thinks about it. In fact, so obviously all inanimate objects, if they are to have a purpose, it has to be objective, because they don't have a point of view. They don't think. So, what is the purpose of this? And the answer is, it's for writing. Does it have a purpose? Yes, it does. It has a purpose objectively. In other words, from the point of view of the universe, this thing has a purpose. It's not a purpose that it made up for itself, because it can't. It doesn't have a mind or feelings or anything like that, I assume. Yes, I do. Yes, I'm starting to lose it. So any object, of course, the only kind of purpose it could have would be objective. Alright, the alternative is a subjective purpose. And a subjective purpose can only be had by beings that can have their own point of view, their own subjective point of view. So, humans could have both. They could have a subjective point of view, which is a subjective purpose, which would be a purpose that they find in their lives. So, for example, in Belshaw's example, the person Angelica, her purpose in life is to grow singing flowers. That's a subjective purpose. It's a purpose that she's given herself. Okay, so you get different. Oh, how could humans have an objective purpose? Well, how does this have an objective purpose? What is its purpose? To write. How did it get that purpose? The answer, it was made with that purpose in mind. So, how could humans have an objective purpose? By the same way. They could have been made with a purpose in mind. Who would have made them? God. So it tends to be that it's religious thinkers who stress that we have an objective purpose. So the usual way that writers on this subject argue that we could have an objective purpose is if there is a creator or being that made us and gave us that purpose. And of course this is what William Lane Craig, being a Christian, believes and argues for. So the only way we can have a purpose is if God exists. So he argues, in fact, that atheists, and it's certainly true, he quotes a lot of atheist writers, can't have a purpose because without God we're just an accident. And, Tolstoy quotes this, suggests the same from the rational scientific point of view, that we're just a fermenting globule. And certainly existentialists argued the same thing, that we don't, that it's kind of unfortunate that there isn't a God. Existentialists didn't believe, well, most existentialists, Sartre, for example, didn't believe. Kierkegaard, an early existentialist, was also a Christian, so you can be existentialist and religious. In fact, Kierkegaard is responsible for the phrase, the leap of faith. Where was I? Oh yes, the distinction between objective and subjective point of view. So, it tends to be that the religious writers stress that the only purpose that counts is an objective one, and the only way you can have an objective purpose is if there is a creator who endowed you with that purpose. Now, Taylor illustrates the difference between objective and subjective nicely by tampering with the story of Sisyphus. As you recall, it's Camus who first talks about Sisyphus as sort of an analogy for our meaningless life. Why? Because his life doesn't have meaning, he just rolls a rock up a hill. So Taylor says, well, let's imagine two ways we could change that story. In one way, he gets a subjective purpose. And that's the way where the gods take pity on him and give him a drug so that he wants nothing more than to roll a rock up a hill. So that's the point to his life. He wakes up every morning and says, oh goody, I get to roll a rock up a hill. This is awesome. Doesn't get any better than this. That would be Sisyphus subjectively imposing meaning on his life. Alternatively, Taylor imagines he could be allowed to get to the top of the hill and build a temple or build a beautiful building. So he is not forever frustrated in his desire to get to the top of the hill, he gets to the top. And he can do something worthwhile when he gets there. Make an amazing building, like the pyramids or something. So that would be analogous to him having objective purpose. And then Taylor says, well, which of them is more worthwhile? And there's problems with both of them. With the subjective, it's like, you kind of pity him. Like, oh, goody, I'm pushing a rock up a hill. You don't think, well, I envy that guy. Or if you do, it's not really in a way that you want to emulate. It's a bit like the dilemma in The Matrix, the movie The Matrix, where you are given an option of taking the red pill or the blue pill, and I can't remember which is which, but in one of them, the pill, you go back into the Matrix, you forget that it's all just a lie fed to you by computers, and you go back to your old life and you're happy in your old life. Your blue pill, I don't know why you need to take this because you're already in this situation, but I think it's the blue pill where you emerge, where you stay out of the Matrix and you realize that true reality is that there's a computer trying to manipulate us. And it's miserable because then you have to fight the computer and it's very powerful, but it's real. Which one should you take? It seems like, giving yourself subjective meaning just pointlessly is cheating. This is Belshaw's worry about Angelica. She's got this purpose that she's given her life, but it's a bit crazy and it's not really going to get anywhere. She's happy, but is that enough? And you might wonder, well, isn't that what happened with Tolstoy? If he just convinced himself that his life had meaning without any real reason, he's just kind of brainwashed himself. Is that good enough? Now, what about the objective purpose? Well, Nozick has a lot to say about this one. Actually, both Taylor and Nozick say things about this, because Taylor and Nozick are the non-Christian writers. So both Tolstoy and Craig are Christian and find meaning in God, although in different ways. Tolstoy, it seems to be subjective. Whereas Taylor and Nozick are, well, I'm not going to say atheistic, but they're certainly secular, and they question the idea that even if there was a God, they don't just say, well, there isn't a God, so you can't have it. They say, well, even if there was a God, let's say there is a God, does that give your life meaning? Suppose there is a God and God made you for a purpose. Great, your life has meaning. Well, what if the purpose is to be eaten by a superior? I mean, think of, this is actually the attitude that a lot of believers take towards animals. They say, not only should we not be vegetarians, we should eat meat. Why? Because God put animals on this earth for us to eat, and it would be kind of ungrateful if we didn't. And besides, they're so delicious. What if it turns out, well, we're like the animals to a better species? God made a much smarter, more beautiful, more long-lived species, and we're feed animals for them. That's what God made us for. So rejoice, your life has meaning. To be a burger. That's what your life is for. Get ready, they're coming, they're going to roast you. Oh boy, the meaning of your life is about to be fulfilled. As Nozick and Taylor point out, that doesn't really sound like what we had in mind. So when we say it's good that God gives our life purpose, it's because we think that it's a good one. And we think that we're going to be really important. We're a vital cog in the machine. Well, suppose we are a vital cog in the machine because these aliens really have to eat. And if we weren't here, they would starve. Because, I don't know, they're making some vast trek across the galaxy and they're out of food, so they have to land on our planet and eat us. And if we weren't here to eat, well, they just can't digest plants. It's got to be humans. So we're a vital cog, and a very tasty one too. That's a bit of a mixed metaphor. Lest you think this is too outlandish, I always think of Judas. Now, Judas gets a bad rap. I believe is it Paradise Lost? Or is it the Inferno? I can't remember. One of those tellings of hell. In one of them, Judas is one of two people. Well, I'm probably it's Dante's Inferno, because the other person being tortured in the foulest, deepest pit of hell is Brutus, who betrayed Julius Caesar. So the person who betrayed Christ and the person who betrayed Julius Caesar are sort of on a par. I'm guessing Dante had that kind of attitude towards the Romans. Anyway, deepest, worst, the worst of the worst, who suffers the most agonizing torment in hell is Judas. But why? If you think about it, Judas is vital, because according to Christianity, Jesus had to die to absolve us of our sins. If he didn't die, we wouldn't be purified. He had to, by his blood, wash away our sins. So if he doesn't die, the purpose is not achieved. So it's vital that Jesus be crucified. And who ensures that he be crucified? Judas. Not only that, Jesus knew this would happen. I mean, Jesus says ahead of time, one of you will betray you, and sort of winks at Judas. So Judas is perhaps the most important person other than Jesus in the story of Jesus. So you'd think he'd be rewarded for this, and presumably he was made for this purpose. Strangely not. Well, there is actually one of the, as you might know, the Bible, which books got included in the Bible was decided by a vote in the, it's called the Council of Nicaea, is it? Where the early church leaders got together and said, that book's in the Bible, that book isn't. So there's a bunch of early Gospels that were very popular at their time that got cut from the official Bible. And one of these that has been recovered, that is as old as the Gospels that we're familiar with, is the Gospel of Judas. And it tells the story from Judas's point of view. And says, I've got a bad rap, you should view me as a hero. And why not? So, Judas, very important purpose, vital to the whole history of humanity according to Christianity. Not really the purpose that I think any of us would want. I mean, you've got a really important purpose. Get ready. It's to betray Jesus and suffer the worst agonies in hell for all eternity. I'm asking a lot here. I hope you'll do it, I don't think we would say, oh, goody, my life has meaning. We would reject that purpose, suggest the writers. So, and in general, even if the purpose sounds like a good one, it's a bit patronizing to have the purpose thrust on you. I mean, I don't know, imagine if your parents said, or, these are actual cases. Suppose your parents told you the only reason we had you was so that you could donate organs to your sibling. We had your sibling, we always intended just to have one child, but turned out she was sick, we didn't want to donate our kidneys, so we had another kid, and your purpose is to donate your kidneys. That's why you exist. Isn't it good to know that your life has a purpose? We made you for that purpose. Again, most people would say, how dare you? How dare you impose this purpose from without? And Taylor, in fact, concludes that the only kind of purpose worth a damn is the one that you give your life. So, there are criticisms of both views. It seems like simply giving your life meaning isn't really good enough, like, Angelica, if it's a stupid purpose, or like the someone who becomes a drug addict and says, my point in life is to lie on a couch, smoking a doobie and eating Cheetos, and watching crappy TV. that's my purpose. I've decided. It's a purpose I can achieve. That's the advantage to this purpose. You know, some people say, I'm going to become a great actor or a great scientist. That's hard. They probably won't. I know I'll achieve my purpose, because here's my couch, here's my TV, here's my supply of medical marijuana, and here's my giant bag of Cheetos. I'm set. My life is purposeful from here on out. We don't find that very convincing. And of course the criticism of the objective purpose is, you know, what if it's one you don't identify with? Alright, so that's the basic background. All of the readings go into a lot more detail, and you have to do the readings. There's one more thing that I want to mention, and I didn't give you this article, partly because Thomas Nagel is a famous contemporary philosopher. I think he's at NYU now. Who wrote a bunch of very influential essays in the 70s on a bunch of topics, and he's like the ideal, because he wrote a different paper on a widely diverse set of topics, and practically all of them like landed with a bomb, and you know, really got people thinking about them. And a famous one by him that you might come across if you ever do any other philosophy classes is one called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? He wrote a famous paper on death, which actually Feldman was an early version of Feldman's deprivation account, if you remember that in previous units. But he also wrote an article called The Absurd, and it's sort of responding to Camus, because Camus talks about life being absurd, and Nagel, being an analytic philosopher, wants to analyze this notion of life being absurd carefully and wonder what exactly it is for life to be absurd, and whether or not this is to be regretted. And he ends up saying, let's see, his view of absurdity. He says, Nagel claims that something is absurd when it involves a clash of two viewpoints, one of which involves taking the event or individual very seriously, and another from which that same event or person appear ridiculous. So there are two viewpoints, and they tend to be actually subjective viewpoint. From a subjective point of view, you take what you're doing seriously. You're rushing to get to a meeting and somebody's slowing you down. You're really pissed off because you're taking it really serious. I've got to do this. But then from above, from the objective viewpoint, from a God's eye point of view, you're like an ant. Belshaw quotes the character Harry Lime from the great film The Third Man, the character played by the wonderful actor Orson Welles. And this character actually hardly appears in the movie, but when he appears, he just blows the movie away. It's a very famous scene. It takes place on a Ferris wheel, and at the top of the Ferris wheel he says, look at those people down there, they're like ants. From above, from the objective point of view, your life looks silly. You're bustling around, taking yourself seriously, but your life is pointless. There's a movie called Microverse or something, which is this French documentary that used these tiny cameras to really get down in the grass and look at what bugs were doing. And there's a scene in this movie where there's a dung beetle. And dung beetles, as you know, get their names by pushing around balls of shit, essentially. And they roll them into these very nice balls, and they roll them around. A bit like Sisyphus, actually. And they get somewhere and they do something with them, and it's important. I don't know if they lay their eggs in them or something. But so you see these beetles pushing these giant balls of dung around, very industriously. And this movie shows one. And actually, it's pushing this ball of dung, and tragically, it's pushing it along, and there's this outcrop of root, and it pushes the dung onto the root, and it gets stuck. And you see this dung beetle like get really frustrated, and it's keeps trying to push it, but it's pushing it further and further onto the spike, and then it eventually gets away with it. But I showed this to my kid when he was little, and he got really upset. So clearly he identified with the dung beetle. But most people sort of laugh at the dung beetle because they're taking the objective point of view. So What Nagel is saying is absurdity comes from the clash of these two viewpoints. A person taking themselves incredibly seriously, but then from the point of the universe, what they're doing is pointless. Again, it's because they're so tiny and insignificant. It's like you look at an ant and they're scurrying around and their life is silly. So, our life is absurd precisely because we're capable of both viewpoints. And perhaps that was Tolstoy's problem. He'd been purely taking the subjective point of view, and then suddenly, somehow, he finds himself looking down from the objective point of view. And from the subjective point of view, it all seemed important. I've got to do this for my farm, I've got to do this for my books, I've got to do this for my kids. There's so much to do. Is this all important? And then bam, from above, it's like, what are you doing? Why do you think what you're doing is important? And so that's Nagel's view, that the absurdity is actually unavoidable for humanity. He says there are beings whose life is not absurd, like mice, because mice cannot step back and take the objective point of view. They're just incapable of it. They just live their micely lives without ever being able to take another viewpoint. And actually Nagel ends up saying it's kind of a distinctly human ability to be able to take both viewpoints. So actually it's only humans whose life could be absurd. Now, does that make it wonderful? No, it doesn't. It's still a problem and it can be challenging, but he advocates taking a slightly humorous and sarcastic view. Don't take yourself too seriously. Don't, if you find yourself thinking, this is so important, and if you find yourself thinking, I've got to kill these people to get my way, well, you really should take the objective point of view and realize that your life doesn't have much purpose. Or, your life is certainly not as important as you think it is. So absurdity comes from this clash of two viewpoints, according to Nagel. Now, he thought that Camus says we've got to recognize that our life is meaningless and strive on regardless. And Nagel found this a little romantic and self-pitying, as he put it. But he advocated just a kind of sardonic approach. A sly smile flickers at the corner of your lips as other people say this is so important, but you realize, well, from a God's eye point of view, it's not all that. Okay, so now Nagel you don't actually read, but one of the writers, I can't remember which, talks about Nagel. Belshaw does. He talks about Nagel. Now Belshaw is actually the only writer who talks about the kind of things that are important to life. And this reminds me a bit of, there is a Monty Python movie. Monty Python is that sort of the Beatles of comedy. They're the English comedy group. They're in the news recently because they just like a couple of weeks ago played a massive stadium in England as their sort of farewell gig, and it sold out in 40 seconds because they're so beloved. They're probably most famous for the movie Monty Python and the Holy Grail in this country, but they did several movies. The last of which was called The Meaning of Life, and that was made in the 80s. And it's pretty radical even today. The director, Terry Jones, who's one of them, said like 4 movies, something like 6 movies that were allowed elsewhere have been banned in Ireland. And he said, and I directed 3 of them. And one of them was The Meaning of Life, because it's not like the other movies. The other movies at least try to tell some kind of coherent story. Like the best of these, I think, is Life of Brian, which imagines somebody living at the time of Christ who is mistaken for a Messiah. And that actually tells a fairly coherent plot, whereas this one is just a set of sketches. But at the end of which, it's you see Eric Idle dressed as a woman, as usually they like dressing as women, saying, oh yes, the meaning of life. Oh, it's the usual things. Be nice to one another. Don't be a jerk, that kind of thing. And he just sort of throws it away at the end of the movie. And that's sort of the impression you get from Belshaw. He says, I'm not going to say anything original here, but have friendships, find a purpose in your life, and, be a good person. That's the meaning of life. And that's a little bit disappointing. As Nozick says, any answer isn't going to work. like it's a fountain. Okay, so it's not a fountain. And the writer Douglas Adams, who actually knew the pythons, wrote a series of books that were massively popular in the 80s, the first of which was called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And famously in that, this alien civilization gets, like Tolstoy, wrapped up in this question, and so they build this supercomputer to work out the meaning of life. And it works for thousands of years, and eventually, to the last vestiges of this civilization, it says, I have my answer. It's called deep thought. And they say, what is it? And he says, it's 42. And of course they're really pissed off because this doesn't give them satisfaction. But I think Nozick says, well, what answer would give you satisfaction? On which note, as my first philosophy teacher said, philosophy is not about answering questions, it's about questioning answers, which is about as satisfying as hearing that the meaning of life is 42. So I'll leave it there.